So it's a great pleasure to be here. I want to say, first of all, I am neither public nor an intellectual. That's the first thing. And one of my hallmarks when I was in government, and I was in government in various stages at various times, was to try to be as unpublic as possible. And I was never accused of being an intellectual. And I hear Charlie Neuhauser, was he a contrarian? That's what I want to know. Yes or no? Yeah, all right. So it's not inappropriate that you should have a contrarian here. All right. So it's a great honor to be here, and it's a great honor to speak in your brother's name. So I want to say that clearly and up front. I also want to say that I'm here in large part because I admire the work and the public work, particularly of Mark Wu, who I think he did an excellent job in government. He's doing an excellent job here, and educating Harvard students is an honor, but a high calling. So, and I know that I know of your work. I've read it. I've followed it, and it's. I would say I approve of it, but that might hurt your career. So I'll just say, well, you guys can draw your own conclusions about that. I would also say I'm pleased to be at the Fairbank Center because while I view China as an adversary, and I do, and you'll see in my remarks I do, and I think it's important that we do, that doesn't mean that I don't like China, right? In fact, to the contrary. When you study China, you come to admire it, right? In this kind of an odd sort of way. I might say I had a similar kind of a transformation with Japan back in the 80s. I was Reagan's deputy USTR. My friends told me it took me 35 years to get a promotion, and I finally got one and became the USTR. But I had a similar when you study the Japanese. But when you study the Chinese history, there's these crazy ups and crazy downs, and they're doing stuff that the rest of the world couldn't even imagine, you know, at that time. And then they'll fall through, and you can sort of see why they view themselves really as destined to be the #1 country in the world, the #1 people. You can sort of see it in their history. In fact, in my book. I'm not going to ask who's read my book. I think that would be appropriate. But in my book, I had a chapter on Chinese history, kind of making these points and drawing the conclusions that I would draw from Chinese history. And the editor said, nah, people don't want to read about history. So sometime I'll publish it. And it probably won't inform very many people here. I was going to call it what Bob Lighthizer thinks everyone should know about Chinese history. But in any event, it's on the cutting room floor. But studying Chinese culture, Chinese literature, Chinese history, Chinese art is something that we really have to do in this world if we're going to compete with them. I worry about the trade gap. But there really is a study gap that's probably even bigger, right? They are studying us a lot more than we're studying them across the board, and that's to our disadvantage, all right? Before I get into the substance of my talk, which is really about our relationship with China, specifically the economic challenge, I think it's important that I take a step back and lay out my core beliefs about trade policy because they really inform my views on how we should take on China. I went into the Trump administration in 2017 for two main reasons. First, I believe our overall trade policy was harming working men and women across America. For decades, many American leaders from both political parties focused single-mindedly on maximizing corporate profits, economic efficiency, and minimizing or optimizing prices. So as a country, we unilaterally lowered our trade deficit, our trade barriers, and created the other side of that, which was a gigantic trade deficit. The result of this policy today is a starker and more indisputable failure than even me and my friends in the skeptical community would have seen. Yes, corporate profits suffered for a select group of importers, technology companies, retailers, and banks, but manufacturing base was hollowed out, and ordinary Americans were left stuck with lower paying jobs and less productive work. Shocking as it may seem, particularly to the students in this room, during much of our recent history, American wealth grew proportionately regardless of economic class. From 1963 to 1983, for example, the wealth of the top 1% of households and the median American household both about doubled. By contrast, between 1983 and 2016, the wealth of the top 1% tripled, and the wealth of the family right in the middle increased by 17%. That is creating a different country than the one we want to live in. Unsurprisingly today, many working class families are forced to rely on 2 full-time incomes in lower-end service sector jobs to maintain the same quality of life that one factory job gave them just a few years ago. This fundamental injustice threatens the health of American society. It destroyed communities across our country and led to so-called deaths of despair for many in the middle class and the lower middle class. In the Trump administration, we worked to address this problem by protecting good-paying manufacturing jobs and renegotiating many of our trade deals. The rest of this story is well outside of the realm of what I want to talk about today, but I think it's important to know my basic philosophy. The second reason that motivated me to join the Trump administration was China. I believe that China is the principal geopolitical rival of the United States and that it is a threat to us. Our economic policy with China, which permits enormous annual trade deficits and massive transfers of American advanced technology, actively undermines our national security. I went into government in 1917 in part to help reset that economic relationship. And in a nutshell, that's the subject of my talk today. Let me start by offering a general geopolitical proposition. The history of the world is replete with examples of great nations facing existential competition. How they react defines not just their history, but world history. I submit that you are living in one of those times. A great power like the United States must realize when it is in such an historic strategic competition with an adversary, and it must take action to preserve its ascendancy. It sounds simple enough. We, of course, need to recognize when another country intends to displace our influence in the world and actively take steps to implement that intention. Yet, as history shows, all too often, countries are slow to come to terms with this reality, and they have paid a dire price for that mistake. Those of you who study history can give numerous examples of this phenomenon. In modern times, you would think of the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, and obviously World War II. To focus on the most obvious example, let's look at the 1930s. German intentions before World War II, looking back, seem clear. Hitler sought to reverse what he called the humiliations of Versailles and to seize living space, in his words, Lebensraum, in Europe. Those intentions became actions as the country began a massive campaign of rearmament, disregarded international treaties, and reoccupied the Rhineland. American businesses, in spite of all of this, remained undeterred. Leaders in the European nation heard these words and saw these actions, but they were hampered by non-military economic demands and distracted by domestic politics. They were slow to address German aggression and continued robust trade throughout the 1930s. Countries like Britain even continued sending dual-use technology to Nazi Germany, including the most advanced British airplane engines. Britain only seriously began rearmament in 1936, 3 years after Hitler took power. Because of that, Germany forced Britain into repeated appeasements throughout the 1930s, culminating, of course, in 1938 with the Munich Agreement. When war actually did break out, Europe was utterly unprepared. It woke up to the threat too late. In the United States, few recognized the threat that Nazi Germany would pose. So American executives competed for business there. 4 months after Hitler annexed Austria, for example, Henry Ford accepted the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest medal that Nazi Germany bestowed upon non-foreigners. Not to be undone, 3 weeks after the Nazi occupied Czechoslovakia, GM chairman Alfred Sloan defended his country's continued operations in Germany as highly profitable. These businessmen helped build up the very industrial base that Germany turned against the United States very soon after. America also remained unprepared for the threat that Japan posed. This was not for lack of evidence. Throughout the 1930s, Japan invaded China twice, terminated its commitment to limit the buildup of its navy, and formed alliances with Italy and Germany. Yet, for Americans at the time, the idea that Japan would initiate a war against the United States was unthinkable. In fact, for most of the 1930s, US military plans presumed that Japan's dependence on trade with the United States meant that Japan would never bring a war against us. As a result, the United States only seriously began rebuilding its navy in the summer of 1940, as Japanese aggression became too obvious to ignore. This late buildup hampered Americans' response in the early days of the Pacific War. The American fleet, which failed to stop the early Japanese advances in the Dutch East Indies, was comprised almost entirely of old ships built before 1930. In stark contrast, Western leaders like Harry Truman, Winston Churchill, and George F. Kennan quickly realized the threat that was presented by the Soviet Union and did not repeat the mistakes of the 1930s. Instead, they recognized the aggressive ambitions of their adversary and began the policy which we think of as the Cold War. We learned quickly that finding out when you're in an adversarial relationship sooner is better than later. Today, I suggest to you that the United States is at another one of those inflection points. We are in a strategic competition with China, whether we want to be or not. Its actions clearly demonstrate that the Chinese Communist Party wants to displace the United States from its position as number one in the world. We should, of course, do all we can to avoid any kind of a military confrontation with China. But as a nation, we have to recognize the threat. Let's begin with the military. Since the 1980s, China has built up its military to challenge American influence in Asia. They have the largest army in the world, and they have the largest navy in the world, and they are growing both. They procure missiles and radar systems designed to strike American carrier battle groups. They build models of US Navy vessels in their desert to provide their military with realistic target practice. They're building missile silos across the country. Further, China is increasingly aggressive on the world stage. The Chinese Navy regularly attempts to intimidate our Navy ships in international waters. And its Air Force repeatedly endangers our pilots in open space. The Chinese government asserts expansive territorial claims against India, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Japan. They've militarized the South China Sea in a way not seen since the Second World War. They have increasingly threatened Taiwan and have sent their warships around Japan. They undoubtedly approved of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and they are supporting it now by buying energy and selling military equipment. They have provided support for American adversaries in the Middle East, stoking a proxy war to undermine our interests. They're also responsible for almost all of the fentanyl that comes into the United States through Mexico. This aggression reverberates back here. We were recently reminded of China's belligerency when late last year 2 U.S. sailors were arrested for espionage. The U.S. attorney in that case said, quote, "China is unrivaled in its audacity and the range of its malign efforts to subvert our laws." The FBI opens a new espionage case against China every few hours and has thousands of active cases right now. Just last week, the FBI director testified before Congress that hackers backed by the Chinese government are targeting U.S. water treatment plants and electrical grids and positioning themselves to take out critical infrastructure. This is the FBI testifying just this last week. They are, quote, ready to wreak havoc and cost real world harm to American citizens, according to the director. Further, China's own words increasingly show their hostility to America. They talk of preparations for the struggle and changes not seen in 100 years. While our Secretary of State was in Beijing on a governmental visit, their president was in another part of China talking to his military about preparing for war. We can also not overlook the economic aggression. For a number of years, the United States and China have been engaged in economic war. Since the 1980s, the Chinese government has engaged in policies that intentionally aim to steal American technology and displace American industrial capacity through joint venture mandates, technology transfer requirements, massive targeted subsidies, and widespread cyber theft and industrial spying. The Chinese government built the world's largest manufacturing economy. Victims of the Chinese economic aggression include almost every major U.S. company: Westinghouse, Apple, Boeing, Micron, DuPont, Google, Yahoo, T-Mobile, General Electric, Coca-Cola, and I'm just scratching the surface. At the same time, our year-over-year trade deficits transfer trillions of dollars of American wealth to China. In 2001, China's GDP stood at $1.3 trillion. 2001, 1.3 trillion, while ours was 10.6. So they were 12% of our size. 20 years later, in 2022, their number was $18.3 trillion and ours was 25. They were 73 times. I'm 73% as large as us. To give you an idea, in the Second World War, the combined economies of Japan and Germany were less than 60% of US GDP. They are rapidly catching up with us. Over the same period, China's annual trade deficit, surplus with them, with the United States, grew from $80 billion a year to $367 billion. The aggregate between 2001 and 2022, the United States imported over $6 trillion in goods, more from China than we exported to China. And these are just the official figures. The likely real number is much higher, particularly if you factor in the value of stolen technology, which has been estimated to be as high as $300 billion a year, the number of Chinese products transshipped through other countries, the effect of a technical deficiency in the way we keep our data called de minimis, which is quite large, and the compounding effect of this wealth transfer. And what has been the result of our technology and wealth transfer? Modern Chinese companies are dominant players across the global value chain. They are market leaders for strategic goods from nuclear power plants, commercial ships, lithium-ion batteries, critical minerals, steel, aluminum, and high-speed rail cars. Chinese control of these industries feeds into the growing modernization of the Chinese military, which now leads the world across crucial military capabilities, including air defense systems, cruise and ballistic missiles, and naval shipbuilding. The Trump administration woke America up to this threat. For the first time, we took actions to confront their economic aggression, imposing a host of tariffs on Chinese goods. We pushed the Pentagon and the Commerce Department to use export restrictions, and we called attention to their military aggression on a regular basis. Today, Americans increasingly realize that China is our largest geopolitical adversary. Both public opinion polls and the actions of our elected officials show this. But while we agree the threat exists, there is no agreement in Washington on the severity of the threat or what steps should be taken to contain it. Indeed, there's a fierce debate on both sides of this. In my view, there are three schools of thought on U.S.-China economic relations. The first one is the do-nothings. They either fail to see the threat that it poses to America, or even worse, recognize it, but deny that we must take any action to limit our wealth and technology transfer. Members of this group are content allowing China to continue to rise, to increase its sphere of influence in Asia and to push us out. In other words, they seek to appease the Chinese side. This camp, to our good fortune, is increasingly ostracized in Washington. And if you need evidence of that, you can look at the recent report of the House Select Committee on China. The second school is the de-riskers. They see some, but not all, of the aspects of the threat China poses. As a result, they recommend moderate policies to limit certain aspects of our economic ties. They sound smart and strategic in theory, but in practice fail to actually address the threats that our wealth and technology transfer pose. I view these more or less as half measures. Let's analyze it a little bit. First, what is de-risking? This is the main economic answer for the current administration and for many in business to this obvious dependency on an adversary for critical supplies and materials. Let's not dramatically change the economic relationship, they say. Let's just have a plan B. If we get into a war or some other conflict and China cuts off our supplies. The problem is that de-risking is fanciful and unachievable. To start, if China acts to cut off supply chains, it will still take time to scale up our hypothetical Plan B resources to meet American demands. Do we really want to force Americans to wait around for critical goods like we did during the pandemic? Making matters worse, as technology advances and the precise nature of critical goods change, these innovations most likely will take place where the products are produced, that is to say, in China. As a result, our hypothetical secondary supply source most likely would not keep up with their Chinese counterparts, and they would soon become obsolete. Another response from de-riskers in government and the business community is a so-called small yard, high fence strategy. You've all heard that. They argue that if we keep the most advanced technologies away from China, not all security technologies, but just the most serious ones, and if it is guarded by a rigorous export controls, technology, and investment restrictions, that's the high fence, we can contain China's military ambition. This policy is also ill-advised. The yard is far bigger than the White House realizes. No one really knows what technologies today will be incorporated in military use in 5 years or more. Indeed, this is the very nature of cutting-edge science. It would not be cutting-edge science if we knew what was coming next. As a result, all the high-tech products and technologies that American companies are selling to China have the risk of being incorporated into their military industry. Further, the notion that we have the technology to actually be the fence, it makes one wonder if that's true, given the amount of hacking and the like, and the breaking into our security system. So the technology that has proven not to work, we're going to rely on to protect us. The second fashionable concept in China policy these days that is worth mentioning is very popular in the Biden administration, and that is they want to, quote, stabilize the relationship. Stabilize is the current word for détente, in French, to relax. Now, I do not mean to suggest that détente is per se a bad policy, but whether détente makes sense depends entirely on where you think the trajectory of the relationship is headed. In other words, if the status quo you are blocking, or you are locking in through détente favors America, then stabilizing would be beneficial. If it favors China, then it obviously wouldn't be. In the first Cold War, Ronald Reagan ran for election in 1980 against détente. He knew that the status quo then favored the Soviets. After he rebuilt our military and energized our economy, he then began talks in the second term because the status quo then was on our side. The results of that strategy are in the history books. The current trajectory is in China's favor, I believe. So now is not the time for détente. Yet the Chinese economy faces serious challenges. But while China's economic growth is slowing overall, China's advanced industries continue to make large strides. One need only look at the Chinese electric vehicle industry to confirm this. Indeed, China's economic woes seem to only further encourage Chinese leaders to double down on their manufacturing-led growth strategy and focus more on expanding exports. And this is going to increase the likelihood of confrontation with the United States and with the West. Meanwhile, China is continuing to develop advanced military systems to build up its forces, and it is pouring billions into AI and advanced computing research. Its defense industry capabilities far surpass our own. To use one example, according to our Secretary of the Navy, one Chinese shipyard possesses more capability than all of ours combined. Given these trends, it is not clear that the United States would win a conflict with China today. And that is not a status quo that you want to lock in. This brings us to the third school of thought, the so-called strategic decouplers, a group which I am a member. When we call for strategic decoupling, we do not mean that we should have no economic relationship with China. That would be a mistake. Instead, we should adjust our economic relationship so that it favors America and our allies. As I detailed to Congress this past May, a strategy of strategic decoupling means putting in place tariffs on Chinese goods to bring about balanced trade. This would stop the annual wealth transfer and ensure American money is not disproportionately padding the profits of Chinese companies. If China buys $150 billion in goods from the United States, for example, we buy the same amount from them. Strategic decoupling also means disentangling our technology through export and import restrictions. We should develop new technology at home and with our allies, and we should severely limit exports of dual-use technology to China, a country actively developing its military to fight a war with us. This just seems like common sense. Finally, strategic decoupling also means regulating inbound investment from China and outbound U.S. investment to China to assure that both are in our national interest. Entities in our adversary should not own strategic assets in our country, and our best companies should not invest in military strategic sectors in our rival. I would say this idea of strategic decoupling is precisely the idea that the Chinese have towards the United States and the world. If you go down every point, they run a surplus on trade, they regulate investment going in and out, and they're developing technology within their own sphere so as not to be reliant on us. So in many ways, I'm just asking for reciprocity. The first steps towards this strategic decoupling began in the Trump administration when we put tariffs on $370 billion of Chinese imports, notably highest on technology imports, and initiated far-reaching export controls. The tariffs have reduced our dependence on Chinese suppliers and forced our companies to shift some manufacturing home and other manufacturing to friendlier countries. The world did not end, despite the prognostications of countless commentators. Companies adjusted, and our bilateral trade deficit with China in those products went down. To its credit, so far the Biden administration has maintained many of President Trump's policies, but we still have key supply chain dependency on China, and much unfavorable trade still remains. We must continue to strategically decouple our economy. I believe this is the key economic policy battle of patriotic Americans in the upcoming generation. Now I'll leave you with this last thought. In July of 1940, when Britain was facing a possible invasion across the English Channel from Germany, Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote a desperate cable to President Roosevelt begging for the transfer of surplus U.S. destroyers. He ended his cable by saying the following, and I quote, "Mr. President, with respect, I must tell you that in the long history of the world, this is a thing to do now. I submit to you today that changing our economic relationship with China is another one of those things." Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. We have one student. He's either leaving the lecture or he's coming to ask a question. I'm decided which. How good is the question?
Hi, I'm Zach Burdett. First of all, thanks for the talk. I appreciate it. Zach Burdett, I'm a student. I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit on the distinction between your vision for export controls and the smaller high-fence approach. So how broadly would you apply these? Can you give some examples of the criteria that are different in your approach from Biden's? And how you deal with the enforcement concerns that you highlighted as maybe being difficult.
So that's a great question. First of all, the Biden administration has been very active in export controls. They have. If you sort of go back, the notion of enforcing these export controls started under the Trump administration. Wilbur Ross, who was Secretary of Commerce, enforced a variety of export controls. The Biden administration have actually expanded. So I'm not disagreeing with that at all. What I'm saying that beyond export controls, we have to develop new technologies in the United States. So I would limit investment going in. I would limit investment coming out. It's those kinds of things that I'm worried about. And in terms of sectors, I think the current Secretary of Commerce is moving in the right direction. But new things come up all the time. You have to stay on top of it all the time. But it was not my comment was not a criticism. So what's the difference between de-riskers just think that that's what you need to do? Go ahead and continue transferring $500, $600, $700 billion a year to China of our natural wealth. They would say that's fine. She would say, no, we don't want it. We don't want strategic decoupling or any other decoupling. So they would maintain the open investment for the most part. President Biden put out an executive order, but it was very limited and much less than anyone on my side liked. But I mean, I should say there are a lot of people in this administration, because this is not meant to be a political speech, who see things the same way I do. This is not a political statement at all. But these things go through a system when an administration, and what they ended up with was quite watered down. So what the de-riskers want is just, they think they can just limit it to just a very small amount of specified security material and technology. And our view is, no, it's much more expansive than that. We need new technologies across the board to be developed independently, the same way that China wants theirs to be developed independently. We want to regulate investment going in and out, and we want balanced trade, not transfers of wealth.
Hi, Ambassador Lighthizer. My name's Christian. I'm a student in the law school. I wanted to ask you, do you perceive there to
You're
be...
either very tall or that's a very low microphone. Could be both, I guess.
I wanted to ask you, do you perceive there to be a problem of elite capture within the American corporate system, within the American political system, or indeed even within American academia? There's been the much ballyhooed problem of research grants that are given to Western researchers, including at Harvard University, that then lead to intellectual property theft by the Chinese Communist Party. What do you make of this problem of elite capture?
So there is anyone who is in this policy area at all is a potential target of elite capture. There's no question in my mind that it's an enormous problem, that the Chinese government is very focused on it. They do it through businesses, and you can sort of see the list of businessmen who come to China and make statements that you would never expect them to make, right? I mean, sort of kowtowing of a sort. You can see it in academia, because that's where the grants are, that's where the money is. You can see it in politics. We have serious American politicians who block, obviously, things that we should do. So the inability of Washington to act on this, and by that I mean basically really the Congress, is all a question of elite capture, in my opinion. I think it's a real problem across the board. And it isn't even just, it's my worry is mostly China, but it's across the board, and a lot of other countries have the ability to kind of move in and manipulate our political system, our academic system, and our business system. So I think it's a major problem. I'm very worried about it.
Hi, Ambassador. Okay, I think this. Hi, Ambassador. Thank you very much for the talk. My name is Diana. I'm a PhD student also at MIT Political Science. My question for you is, as an advocate of the, thank you very much. All right, as an advocate for the strategic decoupling scheme, how do you assess the trade-off or the potential loss of profits from strategic decoupling? And by profits, I mean both the short-term profits, commercial profits from cutting off trade ties and losing the Chinese market, and also the sort of technology or technological profits from cutting off the potential technology cooperation, working with diverse crowd of talents.
Well, in the first place, any technology company that's operating in China is putting at risk all of its technology, right? Because and I tried to give as many examples as I could of companies that have had their technology, their business know-how and their technology taken, and then a Chinese competitor growing up. I mean, you've seen it in industry after industry, and the most recent one you've seen now is the auto industry, right? Ford hasn't made money there in years. They turned over their technology through a joint venture. General Motors doesn't even break out the money anymore. Now you have Tesla, who's got billions of dollars invested over there, now wanting tariffs on automobiles because they realize that they're going to end up losing. So in terms of the trade-off, if I'm selling you $150 billion worth of stuff and about 50 of it is agriculture, and you're selling me $500 and X billion worth of stuff, a lot of which is technology and computers and the like, I think I'm on the bad side of that deal. I think net for America, we're far better off breaking that line. And the other thing that I said that I really want to emphasize, it's Chinese policy to develop their technology without dependence on the West. And it's not like this is Lighthizer's opinion. You can read it. There are some Chinese friends in the audience. I mean, one of the things about China's system is they basically write down and tell you what they're doing, right? Look at China made in China 2025, whatever, 10 years ago. I mean, it was literally, they said, here's what we're going for. These are the things. There's no secret about it. So we know what is happening there, and this is their policy. So for us to go along and say, we're going to develop technology with you, and your policy is to develop technology independent of us, how is that going to work out for us, right? You don't have to be a whatever smart anymore. It used to be a rocket scientist. It probably isn't that anymore. I don't know, whatever smart people. You don't have to be a smart person anymore. You don't have to be a Harvard student to figure that out. You can figure that out if you're at MIT, for God's sakes.
Hello, Ambassador. I'm a PhD student here at Harvard. I was wondering if you could elaborate on your vision for how to indeed go about strengthening domestic capacity in advanced technologies, especially given that, market mechanisms for, if you're controlling exports, that starves a lot of the domestic manufacturers, ability to grow their capacity through those exports. So how would you go about actually strengthening that in the United States, and what do you think a future potential new Trump administration would do in that regard? Could we expect to see government subsidies, things like the Chips and Science Act 2.0, or what are other mechanisms to get there?
So that's a great question. There are, in the first place, the people who are strategic decouplers or skeptics of this relationship or the like are not Republican or Democrat, right? I've got a lot of people in both parties who think I'm crazy and a lot who think I'm right. And this issue of subsidies is another example, right? There are a lot of Republicans who have the view that, subsidies are bad, and of course they are distortive, and we have to be skeptical of them. But there are a lot of Republicans who, we should never subsidize. And let's take chips, for example. So if that's your policy, then you are condemning yourself to losing the battle for chips, right? Because Europe is subsidizing, Korea is subsidizing, Japan is subsidizing, and China is subsidizing. So unrelated to our competition with China, I think we have to have a sensible policy of investing government money in a variety of high technology. And I'm for sure. Now, the CHIPS Act, I mean, I supported the CHIPS Act. I thought it was flawed in the way that most of our legislation is, right? I mean, it's all kind of, I mean, you know, I don't care whether they require daycare centers at chip plants, right? I'm more interested that they're getting the chips real small, right? That's kind of like, you know. But they do all this, and that's how we operate. At one point in my career, I worked for Senator Bob Dole, who was one of my great heroes, and I was telling him when we did a bill, I said, you know, there's a lot of problems with this bill. And he said, Bob, that's why we're going to be here again next year. So hopefully they'll come back next year and they'll fix some of these things. But we have to have a sensible policy. And I was testifying before the China Commission, and on the panel was Eric Schmidt. There were three of us, and he was on the panel. And he was talking basically about technology. And I'm like, guy really seems to know technology. It turns out I was right, he does. And one of the congressmen then asked me, what should we focus on? And I said, well, you know, ask him, because he actually knows this stuff. But in my opinion, if you want a starting point, go to Made in China 2025. Like the smartest people in China sat down and said, what do we have to focus on? And they came up with, you know, advanced computing, advanced materials, robotics, semiconductors. You can write down the lines. A few of them you wonder about. But I said, and Schmidt, of course, agreed. This is the obvious list, right? Smart people came up with this list, and we have to invest in that, or we're going to lose, period, full stop. Now, my own personal view is we've got to figure out a way to invest so that when we transfer government wealth to create a new technology, all the benefit of that technology doesn't go to a handful of rich people, right? Which is, we've tended to make that mistake from time to time in the past. It's got to be a way that it comes back to the working class people, or comes back to the government, or something to some extent. So I think we have to sort our way through that. But sure, in my opinion, we need subsidies, and we need better education. Obviously, that's a part of it. We need to have the best educational system, and we need subsidies for specific technologies.
Hello, Ambassador. Thanks again for your talk. My name is Alex Wolf. I'm a first-year master's student at Tufts Fletcher School. My question for you is with regard to what you said about this challenge being one of the defining challenges for young patriotic Americans. And I'm curious, as someone who might identify as a young patriotic American.
You look like one to me, if that means anything.
If you feel that the U.S. government, as it currently stands, is equipped to handle this China challenge, this China trade trap. I've understood that there's been institutional debate between the Commerce Department, Treasury, between Office of USTR, and I'm curious about your opinion regarding whether these three bodies have the capacity to handle this threat, if there needs to be something new or simply a reshuffle.
So there's like ways I think about that question. I don't want it to be a partisan question, because this is not a Trump versus Biden problem. This is America versus the world, and America versus China problem. Institutionally, we have had the same kind of problems on trade generally for 50 years. And the State Department is basically not for America, right? The Commerce Department partially is and part isn't. The Defense Department is for the Allies and not America. Treasury Department doesn't want anything to do with any of us here. And USTR generally tends to be on the side of America, but it goes through phases where it's just in favor of some theoretical free trade notion. So you sort of look at these institutional positions, and I remember I was doing this in the 80s in Reagan. I'm thinking, these people they're all, none of them aged. They're all saying the same thing they said 40 years ago. You have these kind of institutions, and focusing on a major competition like this is not something that any of the government is set up to do very well. So really what you need is congressional leadership, and we have a difficult situation there for a variety of reasons. So you really need a president and a vice president and the senior officials of the government to kind of realize we need a coordinated plan. But the institutions that we have established are not particularly helpful, in my opinion. They tend not to be good at focusing like this. Now, my only hope is that the Chinese have the same problem. And my guess is they probably do, right? They probably have the same kind of institutional issues that we do in this great competition.
Thank you, Ambassador Lighthizer. My name is Cristian Rodriguez Schifel. I'm a fellow at the Rockefeller Center here for Latin American Studies and a former trade negotiator. And I want to take you to that turf, and I have a question regarding the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
A question behind
the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Yeah, the TPP.
Oh, goodness. Is everybody ready for a long answer? Go ahead.
Of course, the strategic decoupling and the battle is not only fought bilaterally, but it's also fought in third countries in different turfs, right? And I'm just wondering if, trying to leave the politics aside, and looking in retrospect, having America, for example, holding a partnership with 13 countries in which the battle between China and the U.S. is currently fought, such as you can just think Vietnam, Chile, Peru, Malaysia, a number of others. Is there a case, to think about the partnership and the free trade agreement such as that, that will have value in the current geopolitical status, also considering that the standards that they were negotiated there were very similar to what you actually negotiated the USMCA?
So, for those of you who thought we were going to talk about China, I'll now take a short diversion. The notion was that you have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which in order to get Canada to join, they called it the diverse and cosmopolitan or something. They had two words. Yeah, they had two like progressive words that in China, the Canadians said, we will not sign. They said, well, we'll call it progressive. All right, we'll sign. You people think I'm making that. I'm not making that part up. So here's the notion. You got 11, here's the notion. You have the 11 countries, the United States joins, we all get together and we oppose China, right? That's kind of the notion of some people. That's probably your thought. And then you see 2 or 3 of the countries say, well, of course China's going to join. I'm like, what's wrong with this picture? How is that going to oppose China? But setting that aside, I would say of the 11 countries, 6 of them, we have free trade agreements with right now. So the notion is we will open up our market more. We will lose more manufacturing jobs. We will transfer more money overseas and buy friends in 5 countries. Because if you could buy friends, we'd already have the other 6, right? I always, when I hear this, I always say these people just don't remember the 80s and the Beatles. You can't buy me love, right? That's just the nature of it. You can't buy me love. But if we could buy it, we'd already have it with the 6, all right? So we have the 5 countries. All right, now, one of them is Brunei, and one of them is New Zealand. So, okay, New Zealand's got a GDP the size of Cleveland, and I don't know how big Brunei's is, but I'm sure there are the Neuhauser family. Let me just put it, it's probably about like this. So, all right, I'm just guessing on that. I haven't seen that, and that's not information. So I'm going to open up. I'm going to give away some manufacturing jobs for those 2. You'd say, no, that doesn't make any sense. Of course, it doesn't make any sense. So what are we left with? Malaysia, Vietnam. Let's take Vietnam. The notion is we're going to give away jobs. We're going to buy more from Vietnam. Going to run a bigger trade, and they're going to like us and not like China. And you look at a map and you think, really? They got whatever they have, an 800-900-mile border and an army in the million. And a history. No, I don't think that's going to happen. But if you assume you could buy love, right, with Vietnam, we now import in the United States 30% of Vietnam's GDP. 30% of all the goods and services in Vietnam are imported in the United States right now. So if you could buy love, we would have it, right? I mean, there's no lopsided relationship. So the notion, so I'm going to give up jobs for that. Malaysia's not quite as bad, but it's a similar kind of a thing. So it makes no sense to me at all. I mean, even conceptually, it makes no sense. You already got the relationships that you need. And then you look at the nature of the agreement itself. You say it's similar. There are parts that are similar to what we did, but parts that are wholly different. For example, under TPP, I don't want to get too much in the weeds. There's something called rules of origin, all right? Where a product has to be made to qualify for the tariff benefits in the agreement. That's the notion, okay? So under the TPP, the way it's negotiated now, you could make a car 45% in Vietnam, 55% in China, and it would qualify as if it was made in America. How the hell does that make any sense? And that's with China not being in the agreement. So the agreement itself is bad. It doesn't cover financial services. I mean, you go right down the line. So it's a poorly negotiated agreement. The basic concept doesn't make any bloody sense at all. It just, you know what I mean? It's like another world. And what it really is, it's a throwback to the old notion that if we give away enough of our wealth, people will like us. And if you have a $1 trillion trade deficit, that's a lot of love we're buying right now, right? We don't need to buy any more love. So put me on the skeptical side of the TPP. It isn't to say we shouldn't work with allies. Obviously we should. Should we do things in digital? We should do things that aren't going to require additional access to our market, but that set rules for the future. And I think Catherine Tai, who's coming down here, has a lot of good ideas, and hopefully there's things we can do. But the notion of giving away more manufacturing jobs when you're running $1 trillion deficit to get people to like you, I'm just not there yet. I told you it was going to be a long answer, but.
Thank you so much for coming up here, Ambassador. My name is Daniel Clark. I'm a grad student at Harvard, studying Master in Real Estate. My question to you is, ever since Nixon took us off from the gold standard, we've been in the global reserve currency of the world. But recently, that's been starting to get challenged by other countries, the BRIC nations, including China as well. How do you see that evolving in the future? Because to me, the competitive edge of the U.S. was the purchasing power of our dollars, because the currency demand that existed to purchase oil. But it seems like if that gets challenged, it seems like our quality of life and our livelihood in this country will drop. But how do you see that evolving in the near future?
So remember, Charlie and I are skeptics. We're kind of contrarians. I'm not particularly in the group that thinks that having the reserve currency is a net benefit to the United States. I think it helps us consume, for sure, but we already consume too much. So that's like not you're right. Does anybody here feel like they don't consume enough, right? Or do you know anyone who doesn't? So that doesn't. It helps you impose sanctions, which is a real thing, all right? But it gives all your factory workers and your middle class workers, it gives them a huge disadvantage at selling products around the world and competing with other people in your own market. So if the dollar is overvalued, and I'm not saying this, but if it's 15 or 20% overvalued, that kills you on exports, and it kills you competing in your own market against imports. So to me, it's a very heavy price. Is it good for bankers and finance? Yes, it's very good for bankers and finance. Is it good for for a working class person in Pennsylvania? I don't think so. For Ohio, no, I don't think so. I don't think it helps those people. So, and I realize that's another sort of a contrarian view, but I think it's a heavy price to pay to be able to sanction people and to make bankers. Bankers seem to be doing great, so I think we could probably make a modification there.
Elizabeth Allison, graduate of the college here, but formerly from the now ruined town of Lorain, Ohio.
Aha! And you do probably know that I'm from Ashtabula.
Yeah, I read your book.
So Lorain, we're like brothers and sisters is what she's saying. To those of you who can't break the code.
And my question is, should the top flight American STEM universities stop training Chinese PhDs?
So this is really a complicated issue for me. First of all, I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert on these things, but it's a complicated issue. On immigration, my basic view is that we ought to take every smart person in the world and bring them, right? That's my own view. Just bring them all here and train them. Now, if you said the person had some connection to intelligence or some reason to think they were going to go back and take secrets or all of that, you've got to have a modification. But I want smart Chinese, I want smart Indians, I want smart, and you can go right down the list. That's probably another one of those lists where if you leave somebody off, wherever you're from, whatever country you're from, the smart people we want to come here, in my opinion, and we ought to hopefully, I mean, it's been a traditional advantage of America is just sort of, taking brains from around the world. Look at our major companies, how many of them have Americans now, people who weren't, or their family weren't born here. So I'm not necessarily that school, but I do believe we have to have opportunities in schools like this for American students too. And I say that because I'm a little always, and once again, I'm not an expert, but I'm a little bothered by this notion that there's an advantage to being a foreign student over a woman from Lorain, Ohio, because she's going to need a scholarship and the other person is going to pay full load. I mean, that whole notion of that, it's not an area where I'm an expert, but it's a notion that troubles me, that the person from Ohio doesn't have at least an equal chance at the same shot. But I'm not one who believes we should cut everybody out of these schools.
Even if they're going back to China to help the cause?
It's more complicated if they're going back to China. I agree with that. If you knew for sure they were going back to China, I guess I would take the position that no, I don't want them. That would probably be my position. But once again, mercifully, no one will ever ask me to make that policy. But that's just an instinct, And I don't think that they should work in our labs, our national labs, and do the kinds of things where there is real possibility of technology theft. Yeah, I'm sensitive to that.
Hello, Ambassador Lighthizer. Thank you so much for taking the time to give the thoughtful and fancy humorous remarks this evening. My name is Irachi. I'm a student at the college, and I study government. So I'm curious a bit more on the kind of geopolitical side of the U.S.-China question. This is a very liberal campus in which I think people have a pretty rosy view of China, and potentially some people will argue, or might argue that it isn't such a problem if we're displaced as number one by China, or that confrontation isn't as inevitable as other people might make it out to be. And so I'd be curious if you could kind of color the picture a bit more of what the worst case scenario is, why people should be more worried than they are beyond Taiwan, the South China Sea, and the more often cited examples. And particularly, I'm curious, you mentioned rhetoric early in your talk.
I mentioned what?
Rhetoric is specifically.
Oh, you mean their own words?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so whether the current Chinese government rhetoric is something that should be, or that illustrates a view towards a future that we should be particularly scared of.
Well, I mean, somebody that has the view that living in China and living in the United States is approximately the same ought to go and live in China and then come back and report whether or not that's true or not. I mean, it might very well be true for certain classes of people. It certainly isn't for most people. So it's a very different atmosphere. But on this question, the fundamental question is there a threat from China? I could elaborate on that, but from my original speech, I think I elaborate about as much as anybody needs. Look at they want to be number one in the world. They'll flat say it. And I mean, there are two sides to it. Are they a threat to us, and are they repressive at home? My own view is that on the at-home thing, that's for China to sort out, right? It's not the position of the United States to say they shouldn't be communist or they should have. I mean, that's not our position. What I'm worrying about is the threat to us and how to keep us as number one. That's my objective. I'm not, that Chinese should figure out their own future, and they have a lot of history of doing it, and They get it right sometimes and they get it wrong sometimes over the course of the last couple thousand years, and they'll sort it out. Anyone who thinks that they're worried about, they're not worried because of repression, ought to go there and find out what they think. But what I'm worried about is the threat to us. And I think it's very clear if you look at the military, if you look at the economic, if you look at what they say, it's not a secret. And I'm not, notice I didn't hang on the whole thing on Taiwan. It's not because of Taiwan. It's you look across the board, they're being very aggressive right now. And I think it's not good for us. Whether it's good or bad for China is for the Chinese to determine, right? It's not for a Lighthizer to say. But I don't think that when you said we're a liberal campus, once you said you were a campus, I knew we were going to be liberal, right? That part wasn't hard. But I don't think it's a liberal conservative thing, right? I really don't. I don't think it's a liberal conservative thing at all. It's, you take most of the liberals that I talk to, they have a way they want to live in the world and how they want the world to be, and it's not a repressive world, or you know what I mean? I don't think these basic notions are all conservative or liberal in the United States. But anyway, maybe that's just naivete. But I do almost live on the Georgetown campus, so I get like half of it. When they walk by my house at night drinking beer, I feel like I'm part of the fraternity. Just like I would if I was in Boston, I'm sure.
Thank you for your talk, Ambassador Lighthizer. My question is about when some of these China-specific trade actions that we've seen over the last few years shift supply chains towards countries that arguably we have stronger influence over, such as Mexico and potentially looking forward to Latin America. Do you see that as a strategic success because we're pulling it out of China's orbits, or less of a success because the jobs aren't coming back, or somewhere in the middle? Oh, yes, my name is Patrick. I'm a young professional in the area.
And you're a patriotic American, too?
I suppose so.
Okay, good. So the notion, a lot of the jobs that aren't coming back to the United States are going, for example, to Mexico. I think, and I've said this here and I've said it in Mexico City, I think a prosperous Mexico is in the interest of the United States. So I think it's best if the jobs come back here. I want Americans to have a higher job participation rate, to have more jobs. I want high school educated people, which is most American workers, to have good paying jobs and be in the middle class. I want all of those things first. But jobs going to Mexico, in my opinion, is healthy for the United States, yeah, for sure. And we've seen an element of that. I think it has had a beneficial effect on them.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Paul Wang. I'm a researcher from Taiwan, currently doing scholar here at the Fairbank Center at Harvard. Your argument for decoupling, technology decoupling from China, rests largely military security rationale that to stop China from acquiring further technologies that could contribute to their military building, so they're building on their military power. But as you yourself admitted, China has already overtook the United States in various technologies, and you then AI and shipbuilding, rightfully so, said China is undoubtedly number one in the world right now, and there are many, many others. So the Australian think tank ASPI, they have an index of 44 critical technologies relevant to U.S.-China competition. They listed 37 of them have China as number one. So how does this sanctions will work when in fact China is already the number one, and you want to impose further sanction and decoupling in order to stop them from acquiring, developing better technology, when in fact they're already on top of us? I don't see how this really.
So what is your solution?
I think those sanctions cannot be the answer by themselves.
They can't be the answer by themselves. Well, if I gave the impression that I think sanctions are the answer by themselves, then that was a mistake. But if I get this every now and then, they say, well, so the 37 37 is basically, there was an Australian study of basic technologies, and they said China was ahead in 37 of the key ones, and they're probably right. But that makes my argument weaker. So what is your answer? They're not going to give, they're not sharing the technology with us. So we should develop our own technology with our own allies ourselves. That's why we come back to our subsidy question. That's why we have to have a plan to do it. But I get this from time to time. People say, well, it's over, let's just give up. And I'm like, what? I mean, you know what I mean? I'm like, well, what? We're not going to give up. Right? We're going to win the competition. And we have to do a lot of things, and we haven't done a lot of things right, but we're starting to do them right now.
I think China, right now, they have 70% of global market share in shipbuilding. So there's nothing our sanction can do to stop China's shipbuilding industry. When in fact, we can't even build more than one destroyer a year across the shipyard in the U.S. If there's anything, it is.
So what is your solution? Tell me that. Just give it to me in a word.
I think it is the United States can learn from what they've done.
Learn to speak Chinese? Is that the answer? So you've already got an advantage. You speak Chinese because you're from Taiwan. For the rest of us, I'm too old to learn. I'm going to have to figure out a way to win in the technology fact. Are they ahead in shipbuilding? Yeah. And the United States had better catch up on military shipbuilding. But I didn't say anything about sanctions on shipbuilding. Did you hear that? Maybe, I don't know. I didn't say anything about sanctions on shipbuilding. No.
Post-sanction, they will also retaliate with things that stop you from.
You sure you're from Taiwan?
Taiwan is already left.
Oh, well, I'm sorry to hear that. You're well ahead of us in technology. Listen, whether or not there is retaliation by China we saw that before. If the imbalance is $300, $400, $500 billion a year, there's a limit to what they can do. All right.
Hi, I'm Aseito, the Weather Health Center visiting scholar. So I'm from Japan, the former adversary. Hopefully today we are like
adversary is a little strong, but I did.
You said that.
I did have a time in my life when I worried more about Japan now than I do now.
My question goes to the distinction between the 1980s, the U.S.-Japan trade war, and today's U.S.-China trade war today, because you were the key person during 1980s.
I'm famous in Japan, for those of you who don't know. From my years with Ronald Reagan, I became famous. So all right, I'm sorry for interrupting you. There's a question here.
Yeah. The question is about the distinction. Also, would you like to ask your frustration towards the so-called like-minded nation, including Japan today?
So what's the difference between our competition with Japan and our competition with China? Japan was an ally, and there was a limit to they weren't aggressive towards the United States. In their own words, they had a big brother, a younger brother. Those were the terms they used in those. They were under our defense shield. And right now, if you said, who is the country that I find most dependable in this struggle, it's without question Japan. And for good reason. All you have to do is look at a map, right? You can say, or a globe, and you can say, oh, now I get it. So, but interestingly, a lot of the things that China does in the mercantilist space, I don't mean the espionage and all that stuff, but a lot of the industrial policy is right out of the Japanese playbook. Precisely the same. Joint ventures, taking down, a lot of that is the same thing. And at one point when I was at USTR, I had a Japanese senior official come in, and he's got charts, and he's showing me what China's doing. And I said, those look like the charts I used to use back in the 80s when I was fighting with you. But there's a fundamental difference between trade disagreements with an ally and trade disagreements with an adversary. I mean, it's just as fundamental as it can be.
also would like to ask your frustration towards the like-minded nation, like Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, whatever. So do you have any,
Well, I mean, you probably noted I get frustrated with a lot of things. And most of these countries are trying to sort out their own policy. And like all of us, they want to have their cake and eat it too, right? They want to get as much as they can from China, which is usually a trade deficit, and a surplus with the United States, right? That's kind of like what they do. And I think people are coming our way in most of these countries. There's a combination of what we did and what the Chinese are doing that is bringing a lot of countries in the direction of realizing that we have this competition and that the United States has got to prevail in the competition ultimately.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. My name is Maximilian. I am an Alvin student at the law school, and I'm from Germany, another former adversary.
Yeah. As I recall, we didn't start either of those.
But my question is regarding Europe today. Of course, Europe still plays an important role globally, and also with regard to China. And I think Europe is currently waking up a little bit on the necessity of economic security. I'm curious, what is your perspective on, you've identified these different camps, where would you place Europe, and what is your position on, does Europe at all matter, or from an American perspective, do you see Europe as an ally, and how do you see the cooperation going?
So I certainly think Europe matters. I certainly think they're an ally. I mean, they are extremely important, and I agree with your basic point that they're waking up. Now, as I say, there's a couple of reasons for that, one of which is Chinese policy. But the other reason that seems to be working up the Europeans is you're finally seeing them go from surplus to deficit. You're seeing massive amounts of cars. And by the way, not all EVs. A lot of those cars are good old internal combustion cars going to Europe. So you're waking people up. So when you say Europe, I always think, there was a great quote from Kissinger a long time ago. He was asked, what does Europe think? And he said, what's the phone number? I'll call them and ask them, what is Europe, right? There are parts of Europe that kind of agree with my perspective and parts of Europe that don't. Probably, setting aside the UK, probably Germany is the most significant, and France. And I think both of them are waking up, both because the trade situation is more alarming for them. They see the trend. The technology situation is far more alarming for them, and they see the trend. So I'm very hopeful on that front, and my hope is that the Germans lead the way. I honestly think that the prior German government, the Merkel government, didn't, for whatever reason, just didn't have a clue. Just, literally, and now I think now facts have changed and all that sort of thing, but that's one of those things, in my opinion, that Chancellor got completely wrong, just did not understand the fundamental geopolitics of it. But I think Germans now are waking up to that, and it's hopeful because it does mean that Europe is waking up to it. But for sure, we need Europe. We need our allies. The reality is that still the best. NATO is still really sort of fundamental to world peace, right? Without NATO, the world would be very, very different. So I'm going to assume that when you go home, you're going to be on my side and proselytize just a little bit. All right, good. Lighthizer, by the way, is a German name. But we were over before you guys started those wars. We were here. We were decidedly on this side. In fact, we were over here before you sent your Hessians to try to stop the revolution. That's how far back we go. In any event, thank you for your question.
Hi. Thank you so much for speaking about Lighthizer. I wanted to ask about two key players within the China trade trap. So first, on your views on Taiwan, especially since former President Trump mentioned that they should all their business away.
He mentioned what?
President Trump mentioned
don't talk about business.
I'm quite curious what your thoughts are on the role Taiwan has to play within China and trade trap, and also Southeast Asia, since Taiwan sees that as a potential loophole within all of the export controls regarding advanced technologies. I'm a current American JD student and a fellow American.
Hi, Ambassador. Thanks again for your time. I'm Katie at 3L at the law school, and also in Professor Wu's class on China and the International Legal Order. As part of the class, we've been talking about whether or not China has a grand unified plan in terms of an ambitious strategy that kind of unifies its approach to economic and military and industrial development. I know you mentioned the Made in China 2025 plan for kind of a unified industrial approach, but I'm curious to hear your take on whether you think China has like a grander unified strategy that unifies the economic development, political development, military development.
So, see, the problem with asking two questions is you can't remember what after the other. Give me the short version.
Taiwan, Southeast Asia, does China have a grand strategy?
So, grand strategy, yes. Southeast Asia, maybe, is the short version. So, Southeast Asia obviously is an important part of the whole strategy. The United States has the advantage. In most cases, we have a trade deficit with all of those countries. You ask about Taiwan specifically. There are a lot of people who want us to have a free trade agreement with Taiwan. My reaction to that has always been, tell me what it is exactly you want, right? And you never quite get an answer. What they come back to is, well, we want to be closer economically to Taiwan. We right now run a very large trade deficit with Taiwan. We're relying on Taiwanese semiconductors, which worries me to death, right? And so the notion of making, in my sphere, trade concessions to Taiwan makes no sense at all, right? I mean, the military, the security part of it, I'll let someone else comment on that and make their own decisions. But from an economic point of view, making further concessions to a country that you have a very large deficit with is a mistake. And in my opinion, we ought to be luring the Taiwan semiconductor industry, or company in this case probably, to the United States and have them manufacture more here. And I think there's some movement to have them do that. It's less true of some of the other countries, but in almost every country in Southeast Asia we have a trade deficit with, and that troubles me. I've always had this sort of view that what's the number one thing you can do for your allies? The number one thing you can do is have the biggest, best military and the biggest, best economy. You want to take care of your allies. The United States has never been aggressive, right? Well, and it may be with the exception of the Spanish-American War, but that was a long time ago. We've never really been territorially aggressive. It's not our posture. We really are there to help defend our allies. And we do it well sometimes, and we don't. We do it well other times. But the most important thing the United States can do, in my opinion, for world peace is to have the biggest, best military and the biggest, best economy. So I'm not in the business of wanting to weaken the United States so that we can have somebody like us more. You've probably noticed that theme running through my comments. I'm not big on that. But the question was about the five. Do I think they have a grand strategy? I absolutely think they have a grand strategy. And as I said, the beauty of China is they'll more or less tell you, right? If you're just willing to listen, they'll tell you what their grand strategy is. Their strategy is to be number one. They already have the biggest military. They don't have the best military, but they got the biggest. You go right down the list of strategic things, and sometimes you have to get someone other than the official source to actually translate what they're saying, but they're pretty good about saying it, and I think they do have a grand strategy. And in that kind of a government, you can move things and do things in a way that we can't. And that can be a plus and that can be a minus, because sometimes you move things in ways that are wrong and you end up, being inefficient.